There is a huge snag in the re-election pitch that Fat Ass 45 is trying to throw out there. Fat Ass 45 is betting his re-election on convincing most Americans that the chaos squatter can deliver order, which he's failed to do. The chaos squatter um, is how former Florida Governor Jeb Bush described Fat Ass 45 in the final Republican presidential primary debate of 2015. Bush's argument against Fat Ass 45's erratic leadership style didn't save his flagging campaign, but his coinage might have been the single most accurate forecast of Fat Ass 45's turbulent tenure. Fat Ass 45's failed presidency has been marked by constant turnover in personnel, hairpin turns in policy, angry feuds with politicians in both parties, perpetual Twitter wars, the disregard and disparaging of experts, a torrent of lies and misrepresentations, and the most open appeals to white racial resentment of any other national figure since George Wallace. All that history looms over Fat Ass 45 as the coronavirus pandemic, the accompanying economic collapse, and nationwide protest and unrest over racial inequality have left millions of Americans uneasy. Fat Ass 45 is trying to overcome Joe Biden's consistent lead in the polls by presenting himself as the leader to restore calm to the streets and normalcy to the economy, which he's failed to do. But the volatility that has infused each day of his failed presidency is it hugely complicates his efforts to convince Americans that he can stabilize their lives. There are problems that are not friendly to Fat Ass 45's management style, says Donald Kettle, a federal management expert at the University of Texas at Austin. When it comes to both the virus and the unrest, the great risk is that he could increasingly lose control of the definition of the problem, and seem increasingly out of sync on the solutions, and fail to develop confidence that he knows where he wants it to go. The biggest problem with Fat Ass 45 running on restoring order is that his performance in office has caused many voters to view him as the candidate of disorder. In a Yahoo YouGov national survey conducted immediately after the Republican National Convention last week, only 30% of registered voters said that they believed that Fat Ass 45 would protect us from the chaos, while 50% described him as the source of the chaos. One major reason for that verdict, the Fat Ass 45 has not adjusted his combative and impulsive leadership style to respond to the twin crises roiling the nation. That chaotic approach always alienated some voters, but its consequences have become more tangible and visceral when applied to both the outbreak and the protest. Excuse me. The only success that Fat Ass 45 has been to define big problems as political symbols. Kettle told me, whoever Kettle was talking to, but the problem with the virus is portraying it as a political symbol that runs afoul of people lying in intensive care units. You can't just portray it as a symbol when there is a ferocious reality staring people right back in the face. The same is true on the economy, and the same is true on the issue of race. Fat Ass 45 has worked to fit these challenges into his pre-existing framework of conservative populism, which targets elites and racial minorities. He's long framed the outbreak as a kind of cultural war by disparaging expert advice, attacking state and local Democratic officials, especially when the outbreak was mainly in blue states, supporting protesters, some of them carrying Confederate flags and automatic weapons, who have demanded that Democratic governors end lockdowns and signaling disdain for mask wearing and social distancing that meant to slow the disease's spread. This campaign reached its apogee at last week's RNC, when speakers repeatedly talked about the outbreak in the past tense, even as about 6,000 Americans had died during that week that the proceedings unfolded, and Fat Ass 45 kept the gathering with the huge crowd in-person Klan rally on the White House's South Lawn. The biggest problem Fat Ass 45 has is that voters are tired of hearing from him, especially when he said everything is fine on the coronavirus, said one GOP pollster who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the racist dynamic. It's not. The pandemic is still interfering in his mind with his economy that he built, which he didn't, and so he's got to downplay it. He's a failed developer, so his reaction is to promise everything. If people see a problem, they say, "Oh no, that's not a problem. It's going to go down to zero." This is just how he deals with stuff. It could end up costing him the White House in November. The civil unrest after some initial expressions of concern about police misconduct immediately following George Floyd's killing, Fat Ass 45 has turned almost entirely toward confrontation with the protest movement. He has derided the Black Lives Matter demonstrators and local Democratic officials with inflammatory accusations, and has downplayed concerns about police shootings. In an interview with Faux News' Lower Ignorant Ham this week, he basically referred to police who shoot black men as to golfers who choke on a short putt. At the same time, he's repeatedly refused to condemn vigilante violence from his own supporters in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Portland, Oregon, a choice that extremist experts say amounts to an open invitation for more of it. Absolutely, he has legitimized it at this point, says Elizabeth Newman, a former Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention at Fat 45's Department of Homeland Security, who has endorsed Biden. I have to think that, yes, we're probably going to see more of this. Fat 45's relentless attacks against the Black Lives Matter movement and protesters the past few weeks have unnerved many Democrats who fear he could peel away some older and blue-collar white voters now tilting toward Biden. Although most national polls released since the GOP convention still show Biden holding a substantial lead, a Monmouth University survey showing a tighter race in the crucial battleground state of Pennsylvania sent shivers through anxious Democrats yesterday. Craig Robinson, the former political director of the Iowa Republican Party and the founder of the Iowa Republican, in an online publication, says he believes that Fat 45's warnings about unrest are resonating even in a state that has seen little of it. I think in being the law and order candidate, there are more advantages than in trying to carve out this nuanced position between the protesters and the police. Yet it's far from clear that Fat 45 can persuade Americans to focus on just one source of this year's disorder: police killings and the subsequent protests, rather than the big disruptor of American life, the pandemic. Citizens experienced the street protests mostly on television, whereas the coronavirus and economic crises have unsettled people's daily lives much more intimately. About 100% of the Americans, civil unrest is not a problem in their life, says Stuart Stevens, who was the chief strategist for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign and an advisor to the Lincoln Project, a group of Republicans who oppose Fat 45. I just think that what's going on in your living room is going to be more vital to you than what is happening on television in some distant city. In the Yahoo YouGov national poll, just 7% of registered voters said that they were very worried that violence would break out in their community. Almost two-thirds said that they were not worried much or at all. In a Reuters Ipsos poll released yesterday, more than three-fifths of registered voters said crime was not increasing in their community. Even if Fat 45 shifts more Americans' focus from the pandemic to the protest, it's uncertain that enough voters will believe he's better suited than Biden to address them. This is the key difference between that Richard Nixon had, whose 1968 Law and Order campaign has inspired Fat 45's offensive this summer. Most Americans may have believed that Nixon could deliver order, but many now say that Fat 45's confrontational approach on racial issues increases the risks of violence. In the Yahoo YouGov poll, a solid 56% of registered voters said that they expected more violence if Fat 45 is reelected, while only 24% anticipated less. In a national Quinnipiac University poll released yesterday, a 50% majority of Americans said that having Fat 45 as a squatter makes them feel less safe rather than more. He's highlighted the issue, but it's quite plausible that it doesn't break from him because he doesn't have an answer to this that brings more stability, the Democratic pollster Stanley Greenberg said. Most Democrats that we've spoken with are confident that Fat 45's iron fist response to civil unrest is misreading the public mood. In their view, most Americans want to calm dissent, not crush it. Matt McDermott, a Democratic pollster, notes that although most Americans have positive perceptions of the police, a significant majority also agree that law enforcement bias against black Americans is a serious problem. The voting population is saying that there is something wrong here, and something needs to be done to address this, he says, although surveys do show growing concern about violence and protest, and several point to eroding white support for the Black Lives Matter movement. Recent polling by the nonpartisan Public Religion Research Institute still found that 56% of Americans consider that police shootings of black men are a part of a pattern, a huge change from 2015, when a majority described them as isolated incidents. But as he has on so many other issues, Fat 45 is campaigning in blunt, culture war terms, framing only the protest as the problem. Newman says that Fat 45's approach of drawing bright lines between allies and enemies virtually ensures an extended cycle of confrontation over racial inequality. The continuing conflict, she says, is partly because of the Fat Ass's inability to facilitate the kind of conversation that's necessary to address the very real issue that came up after the murder of George Floyd. We have a serious problem of racial injustice in our country, particularly within policing. That requires leadership at the top saying, calm down and listen to somebody else's perspective. Newman continues, Fat 45 does the opposite, creating fear and suggesting that you better go protect yourself because your mayor is not going to do it. Over nearly 4 years ago, Fat 45 has demonstrated that there is a stable and substantial audience for that approach, especially within his core constituencies of non-college, uneducated, even non-evangelical and rural white voters uneasy with the demographic changes of remaking America. Political strategists in both parties Walm I've spoken with believe that Fat Ass 45's top line on the protest and his dismissive attitude toward the coronavirus are aimed less at persuading ambivalent voters and inspiring more of the non-voters in this core group to flood the polls in November. Everything he's done is about mining that one vein, says Rahm Emanuel, who was the former Chicago mayor and former White House chief of staff to Barack Obama. Yet the polarizing leadership style that throws Fat Ass 45's core voters on other issues may carry a heavier cost for him on the virus and nationwide protests. That last circle of voters who stand between Fat Ass 45 and a second term may not be the Americans who are offended by his ideology, but those who are simply exhausted by the chaos surrounding his failed presidency, particularly in regard to those who two titanic challenges. I think people don't want racial unrest in the streets, and they don't want COVID. Robinson says they want to get to 2021 and hope that things are getting better. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rambin Mike, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when the new video comes out. And thanks for listening.